Here's a pattern that has destroyed every major empire in history. Not conquest, not invasion, not revolution. Economic collapse, specifically, currency collapse. And it happens the exact same way every single time. Rome, the empire that ruled the known world for 5 centuries, collapsed when its currency became worthless. Spain, which controlled more gold and silver than any nation in history, went bankrupt repeatedly until its empire dissolved. Britain, which dominated global trade for 200 years, lost its empire within a decade after its currency collapsed. 4 times in recorded history, a dominant empire has followed this exact pattern. Military overextension, unsustainable spending, currency debasement or money printing, inflation, loss of confidence, collapse. And every time, the people in power believed they were different. That their empire was special, that the old rules didn't apply to them. They were wrong every single time. And right now in 2025, the United States is following that exact same pattern, step by step. Warning sign by warning sign. The only question is whether we're near the beginning, the middle, or the end. This is the story of how empires destroy themselves through their own currency. How it happened to Rome, Spain, and Britain, and why every warning sign says it's happening again. But the story behind it isn't what you think. Stay tuned to learn more. In this video, we'll uncover the hidden patterns of the empire collapse cycle and why they matter today. We'll break down each stage with key facts from historical data. Each empire believed it had discovered a way around economic reality. Each empire was convinced that its military power, its technological advantage, or its control over resources made it immune to the laws that destroyed previous civilizations. And later, you'll discover the one factor that could repeat soon, the single element that, when it appears, accelerates collapse from decades into years. Let me be clear about something from the start. This isn't about politics. This isn't about left or right, conservative or progressive. This is about economic patterns that transcend ideology. Patterns that have repeated across 2,000 years of human history. Patterns that don't care what you believe or what policies you prefer. They just repeat. So let's start with the pattern itself, the 4 stages that every collapsing empire follows. Stage 1, military overextension. The empire expands its military presence far beyond what its economy can sustainably support. Bases in foreign lands, troops stationed across continents, constant military operations draining the treasury. Stage 2, unsustainable spending. To maintain that military presence while also funding domestic programs and satisfying various political constituencies, spending accelerates beyond revenue. Deficits become structural, not temporary. Debt compounds. Stage 3, currency debasement. When tax revenue can't cover spending and borrowing, becomes difficult or expensive, empires turn to the printing press. They debase their currency. In ancient times, this meant reducing the precious metal content in coins. In modern times, it means expanding the money supply. Stage 4, inflation, loss of confidence, collapse. More currency chasing the same amount of goods creates inflation. As inflation accelerates, people lose confidence in the currency. They dump it for hard assets, foreign currencies, or barter. The currency's value plummets, and with it, the empire's ability to function. This isn't theory. This is documented historical fact. It happened to Rome. It happened to Spain. It happened to Britain. And the most disturbing part, each stage leads inevitably to the next. Military overextension creates spending crises. Spending crises lead to currency debasement. Currency debasement triggers the final collapse. It's a chain reaction, and once it starts, history shows it's almost impossible to stop. Let's start with Rome, because Rome's collapse is the template, the original case study in how an empire destroys itself through currency manipulation. 2nd century AD, Rome is the superpower of the known world. The Roman Empire controls territory from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to Syria. The Mediterranean is literally called our sea. Roman legions are undefeated. Roman engineering is unmatched. Roman law governs hundreds of millions of people. And at the center of this empire's power is a coin, the denarius. The denarius is Rome's currency. More than that, It's the reserve currency of the ancient world. When traders in Egypt do business with merchants in Gaul, they settle accounts in denarii. When kings pay tribute, they pay in denarii. The denarius is backed by the full faith and credit of the world's dominant military power, and it's made of silver, pure silver. Well, almost pure. Under Augustus, the first emperor, the denarius contains about 95 to 98% silver. It has intrinsic value. You can melt it down, and the metal itself is worth something. This is crucial. Remember this detail, because it's about to change. Rome in the 2nd century is at its peak, but maintaining an empire is expensive, astonishingly expensive. Legions must be paid. They're stationed everywhere: Britain, Germania, Syria, Egypt, North Africa. Tens of thousands of soldiers, each requiring salary, equipment, food, and supplies. Roads must be maintained. Aqueducts must be built. Grain must be distributed to Roman citizens for free. The government has promised bread and circuses. That promise must be kept, or riots follow. And then there are the wars, constant wars, border conflicts, rebellions, invasions. Each war costs a fortune. Rome's revenue comes primarily from taxes and plunder. But here's the problem. Once you've conquered most of the known world, there's not much left to plunder. The easy conquests are over. The remaining territories are either too poor to be worth taking or too difficult to subdue. So, tax revenue must carry the load. But taxes have limits. Push them too high, and you trigger rebellion. Tax collection becomes impossible when the population is starving. Rome reaches stage 1 of the pattern: military overextension, legions everywhere, costs spiraling, revenue plateauing. This leads inevitably to stage 2, unsustainable spending. By the 3rd century AD, Roman emperors face a brutal reality. They need more money than they have. They need to pay the legions, or the legions will rebel. They've seen it happen. Soldiers who aren't paid don't just quit. They march on Rome and install a new emperor, one who will pay them. So, emperors must find money, somewhere, anywhere. They try raising taxes. It doesn't work. The economy is already struggling under the tax burden. They try confiscating wealth from the rich. It helps temporarily. But you can only confiscate so much before the wealthy flee or hide their assets. They try cutting spending. But where? Cut the military, and you face immediate rebellion or invasion. Cut the grain distribution, and Rome's citizens riot. There's only one option left, the option that every empire in this position eventually chooses. They debase the currency. Stage 3. Here's how it works. Remember the denarius? That silver coin that's 95 to 98% pure under Augustus? Emperors start reducing the silver content. Slowly at first, then faster. They melt down the old coins. They add cheap base metals like copper or bronze to the silver. They remint the coins with the same face value, but less actual silver. Instead of 1 denarius made from pure silver, they can now mint 2 denarii from the same amount of silver by diluting it with copper, or 3, or 4. It's alchemy in reverse, turning silver into copper, turning value into paper. Well, into cheap metal. The numbers are staggering. Under Augustus, around 27 BC to 14 AD, the denarius is about 95% silver. By 100 AD, it's dropped to around 85%. By 200 AD, it's down to 50%. By 270 AD, under Emperor Aurelian, the denarius contains only about 5% silver. Read that again. The currency went from 95% silver to 5% silver in roughly 250 years. That's not a minor adjustment. That's total destruction of the currency's intrinsic value. And here's what happens next. Stage 4, the consequences. At first, nobody notices. The coins look similar. They have the emperor's face stamped on them. They're official currency. Merchants accept them because, well, what choice do they have? Refusing imperial currency is dangerous. But people aren't stupid. They notice the coins are lighter. They notice the silver content is dropping, and they adjust. Prices start rising, not slowly, dramatically. If the currency has half the silver it used to have, merchants charge twice as much. It's simple economics. A measure of wheat that cost 2 denarii in 200 AD costs 400 denarii by 301 AD. That's a 200-fold increase in 1 century. Bread, the staple of the Roman diet, becomes unaffordable for ordinary citizens. Soldiers notice their pay is worthless. They're still getting paid in denarii, but those denarii buy almost nothing. A soldier's annual salary used to feed his family. Now, it barely buys a week's worth of food. What do soldiers do when they're not paid properly? They mutiny. They rebel. They auction off the emperor's throne to whoever promises more money. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome has at least 50 emperors. Most reign for less than 3 years. Most die violently. This period is literally called the crisis of the 3rd century. Tax collection collapses. The government demands taxes in denarii. But denarii are worthless. People pay their taxes in debased coins that have no value. The government receives currency it cannot use to buy anything. Think about that. The government collects taxes, but the money it collects is worthless. It's a bureaucratic nightmare that destroys the empire's ability to function. Merchants stop accepting denarii entirely. They demand payment in goods, in services, or in foreign currency. The Roman economy reverts to barter. The sophisticated monetary system that enabled trade across an empire collapses into primitive exchange. People hoard anything of real value: gold, silver, grain, olive oil, tools. They bury their wealth to hide it from confiscatory taxes and roaming soldiers. Archaeologists today still find hordes of Roman coins buried in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Citizens literally buried their money rather than trust the banking system or the currency. The empire fractures. Regions stop sending tax revenue to Rome because Roman currency is worthless. They keep their resources local. Generals declare themselves independent emperors. The empire splits into multiple competing states. And here's the crucial detail everyone misses about Rome's fall. The Western Roman Empire doesn't collapse militarily until 476 AD, but its currency collapse happens in the 3rd century. 200 years earlier, the military fall is the symptom. The currency collapse is the disease. Rome didn't fall because barbarians were strong. Barbarians had been attacking Rome for centuries and losing. Rome fell because it couldn't pay its soldiers. It couldn't collect taxes. It couldn't maintain its infrastructure. It couldn't function as an empire. And why? Because it destroyed its own currency. The emperors who debased the denarius thought they were being clever. They thought they'd found a way to pay for everything without raising taxes. They thought the people wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. They were wrong. The people noticed. The consequences were devastating. And those consequences ended the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. Now here's where it gets disturbing. Every emperor who debased the currency knew what previous emperors had done. They knew the currency had already been debased. They knew it was causing problems. And they did it anyway. Why? Because they faced the same impossible choice: pay the bills or collapse immediately. They chose to pay the bills by printing money, knowing it would cause collapse eventually. They kicked the can down the road. They chose slow poison over quick death. Each emperor believed he'd be gone before the consequences hit. Each emperor believed the next emperor would deal with the crisis. Each emperor told himself the empire was special, that it would survive, that somehow the old economic laws wouldn't apply. Sound familiar? It should. Because the United States has military bases in over 80 countries. Because U.S. debt exceeds $34 trillion. Because the Federal Reserve expanded the money supply by trillions between 2020 and 2025. Because inflation has returned after decades of stability. Stage 1. Military overextension? Check. Stage 2. Unsustainable spending? Check. Stage 3. Currency debasement? Check. Stage 4. Loss of confidence and collapse? Not yet. But the warning signs are flashing. But Rome wasn't the last empire to ignore this pattern. Rome wasn't even the most dramatic example. That distinction belongs to Spain, the empire that controlled more gold and silver than any nation in history, and went bankrupt 4 times. Here's how an empire drowns in wealth. The year is 1492. Christopher Columbus lands in the Americas, and Spain is about to become the wealthiest nation on earth. Within decades, Spanish conquistadors discover something that changes everything. Silver, gold, mountains of it, literally mountains. In 1545, Spanish forces discover Cerro Rico in Potosi, in what is now Bolivia. It's a mountain made almost entirely of silver ore, the richest silver deposit ever found in human history. For the next 200 years, this single mountain produces roughly 60% of all the world's silver. Spanish galleons begin making regular crossings of the Atlantic, loaded with treasure, gold from the Aztecs, silver from Potosi, emeralds from Colombia, the wealth of an entire continent flowing into Spanish ports. Spain doesn't just have gold and silver. Spain has more gold and silver than every other European nation combined, more than Rome ever possessed, more than any empire in history up to that point. And here's what nobody tells you about Spain's collapse. With all that wealth, with unlimited access to the world's most valuable resources, Spain went bankrupt in 1557, then again in 1560, then again in 1575, then again in 1596. 4 bankruptcies. 4 declarations that the Spanish crown could not pay its debts. 4 times that Spain defaulted on loans from European bankers. How is that possible? How does a nation with infinite wealth go bankrupt? Not once, 4 times. Because Spain followed the exact same pattern as Rome. Stage by stage, warning sign by warning sign. Let's break it down. Stage 1. Military overextension. Spain in the 16th century is fighting everywhere. Wars in Italy, wars in the Netherlands, wars against France, wars against the Ottoman Empire, wars against England, the Spanish Armada. Constant expensive military campaigns across Europe and the Mediterranean. Spain has the largest military in Europe. Spanish infantry are considered the best soldiers in the world, but that military dominance costs a fortune. Soldiers must be paid, fleets must be maintained, fortresses must be built and garrisoned. King Philip II of Spain, who rules from 1556 to 1598, spends 75% of Spain's revenue on military operations. 3/4 of everything Spain earns goes to war. That leads directly to stage 2, unsustainable spending. Even with all the silver from Potosi, Spain spends more than it takes in. How? Because wars are expensive. Because maintaining an empire across multiple continents is expensive. Because the Spanish court is expensive. Palaces, ceremonies, patronage, bureaucracy. Spain borrows heavily from European banks, mostly from German and Italian bankers. The interest payments alone consume massive portions of Spain's revenue. Here's where it gets interesting. Spain has all this silver coming in from the Americas. So, the Spanish crown does something that seems logical. It uses that silver as collateral. It promises future silver shipments to bankers in exchange for loans today. But the silver that arrives isn't enough. Spain has borrowed against future revenues that never materialize, or that arrive but must be immediately sent to pay off previous debts. Spain is in a debt spiral, borrowing to pay off loans, taking new loans to cover old obligations. By 1557, just 65 years after Columbus's first voyage, Spain defaults. The crown declares it cannot pay. Banks across Europe lose fortunes. Soldiers go unpaid. Spain's credit rating collapses. And then something remarkable happens. Spain recovers. More silver arrives from the Americas. Bankers, desperate to recoup their losses, lend to Spain again. And Spain repeats the exact same pattern. Overspending, overborrowing, defaulting. 1560. Bankruptcy number 2. 1561. Bankruptcy number 3. 1562. Bankruptcy number 4. But here's the part that destroys Spain permanently. Stage 3. Currency debasement through inflation. Spain doesn't debase its coins the way Rome did. Spain's coins remain relatively pure silver and gold. But Spain does something economically equivalent. It floods Europe with silver. Between 1500 and 1650, Spanish silver mines in the Americas produce approximately 150,000 tons of silver. That silver flows into Spain and then spreads across Europe as Spain uses it to pay soldiers, buy supplies, and import goods. And here's what happens when you massively increase the supply of money. Each unit of that money becomes less valuable. It's the same principle as Roman debasement, just accomplished differently. Historians call this the price revolution. Between 1500 and 1650, prices in Spain increased by roughly 400 to 500%. Bread, wine, cloth, labor, Everything becomes more expensive, not because goods are scarce, because silver is abundant. A Spanish worker earning silver wages finds that those wages buy less and less. A merchant accepting silver in payment must charge more and more to cover his own rising costs. The economy spirals into inflation, and here's the paradox that destroys Spain. The more silver arrives from the Americas, the worse Spain's economy becomes. The wealth that was supposed to make Spain invincible actually weakens it. Why? Because Spain stops producing things. Why manufacture goods when you can import them with silver? Why develop industries when mining is more profitable? Why build a diversified economy when treasure is flowing in? Spain becomes dependent on imports, food, manufactured goods, weapons, everything. Spanish silver flows out to pay for these imports. And as more silver floods European markets, Spanish silver buys less and less. By 1600, Spain is importing food to feed its population. A nation that once fed itself now depends on foreign grain. Its manufacturing base has withered. Its economy is hollowed out. All that remains is a massive military, crushing debt, and a declining flow of silver as the mines begin to deplete. Stage 4, loss of confidence and collapse. By the 1640s, European bankers stop lending to Spain. The risk is too high. Spain has defaulted too many times. Its economy is in shambles. Its silver flow is declining. Spain loses its European territories. The Netherlands breaks away. Portugal regains independence. Italian territories are lost. The Spanish Empire contracts. By 1700, Spain is a second-rate power. The nation that once controlled more wealth than Rome, the nation that owned half the New World, has collapsed into economic irrelevance. And every step of the way, Spanish monarchs believed they were different. They had unlimited silver. They had God on their side. They had the best military in Europe. The old rules didn't apply to them. They were wrong. Now, let's talk about Britain. Because Britain's collapse is the fastest in recorded history. 1914. The British Empire is the largest empire ever created. It controls 25% of the world's land surface, 20% of the world's population. The sun literally never sets on British territory. The British pound is the world's reserve currency. When nations trade with each other, they settle in pounds. When central banks hold foreign reserves, they hold pounds. London is the financial capital of the world. Britain dominates global shipping. The Royal Navy is the most powerful military force on Earth. British colonies provide raw materials. British factories produce manufactured goods. The entire system seems unshakable. Then comes World War I. Britain survives, but at enormous cost, massive debts. A generation of young men killed, economic disruption. The empire is weakened but still dominant. World War II finishes the job. Britain goes into the war as an empire. It emerges from the war as a debtor nation. Britain owes money to the United States. It owes money to its colonies. Its economy is shattered. Its infrastructure is bombed. Its financial reserves are depleted. Stage 1 and 2 hit simultaneously. Military overextension from fighting 2 world wars. Unsustainable spending from war costs and reconstruction. Britain turns to stage 3, not all at once, but steadily. The pound is devalued in 1949, then again in 1967. The government expands spending beyond what the economy can support. Inflation begins to rise. And then comes 1976, a year that should be remembered as one of the most humiliating moments in British history. Britain faces a currency crisis. The pound is collapsing in value. Inflation is out of control. The government cannot borrow enough to cover its spending. Britain, the nation that once ruled a quarter of the world, goes to the International Monetary Fund begging for a loan. The IMF grants the loan, but with conditions, harsh conditions. Britain must cut government spending. It must raise interest rates. It must accept IMF oversight of its economic policies. Read that again. In 1976, just 31 years after winning World War II, Britain surrenders economic sovereignty to the IMF. The empire that dictated terms to other nations must now accept terms from international bankers. The empire dissolves rapidly after that. India had already gained independence in 1947, but the remaining colonies break away in quick succession. Hong Kong, the crown jewel of British trade in Asia, is handed back to China in 1997. From 1945 to 1997. 52 years. That's how long it took for the British Empire to go from ruling the world to surrendering its last significant colony. Rome took centuries to collapse. Spain took about 150 years. Britain collapsed in half a century. The pattern accelerates each time it repeats. And now, we arrive at the question that should terrify every American. The question that was asked at the beginning of this video. Is the United States following this pattern? And if so, where are we in the cycle? Let's examine the evidence, stage by stage, fact by fact. Stage 1. Military overextension. The United States maintains approximately 750 to 800 military bases in over 80 countries. That's more military bases in foreign countries than any nation in history. Roman legions at their peak were deployed in fewer locations. The U.S. military budget in 2024 exceeded $800 billion. That's more than the next 10 countries combined. Military spending consumes roughly 13 to 15% of the federal budget. And that doesn't include veterans' benefits, intelligence agencies, or the Department of Homeland Security. American troops are stationed in Germany, Japan, South Korea, Italy, the United Kingdom, dozens of other nations. Carrier groups patrol multiple oceans simultaneously. Special operations forces conduct missions in countries most Americans can't locate on a map. This isn't a political judgment. This is observable fact. The United States maintains a global military presence that dwarfs anything Rome, Spain, or Britain ever attempted. Stage 1, check. Stage 2, unsustainable spending. The U.S. national debt exceeds $34 trillion as of 2024. That's trillion with a T. The debt to GDP ratio is over 120%. The government spends significantly more than it collects in revenue, every single year. Interest payments on the debt now exceed $600 billion annually. That's more than the United States spends on education, transportation, and science combined. The government is borrowing money to pay interest on money it already borrowed. Both political parties contribute to this. Republican administrations increase military spending and cut taxes. Democratic administrations increase social spending. Neither party seriously addresses the debt. Why? Because cutting spending is politically suicidal. Raising taxes is politically suicidal. So, both parties choose the politically easy option: borrow more. The deficit is structural, not temporary. Even in years of economic growth, the government runs deficits. There is no plan to balance the budget. There is no political will to make the necessary cuts or raise the necessary revenue. Stage 2, check. Stage 3, currency debasement. The United States doesn't reduce the gold or silver content of coins like Rome did. Modern currency isn't backed by precious metals at all. It's fiat currency. Its value is based entirely on confidence in the U.S. government. But the Federal Reserve can expand the money supply. And it has, dramatically. Between 2020 and 2022, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Federal Reserve expanded the M2 money supply by approximately 40%. That's not a typo. In 2 years, the money supply increased by 40%. That's the equivalent of what Rome did over 2 centuries, compressed into 2 years. That's faster than Spain's price revolution. That's money printing on a scale that would make even desperate Roman emperors hesitate. The justification was economic stimulus. Prevent recession. Help struggling businesses and individuals. Those are valid concerns. But the economic law doesn't care about justifications. More money chasing the same amount of goods creates inflation. And inflation returned. After decades of relatively stable prices, inflation in 2021 and 2022 reached levels not seen since the 1980s. Food prices surged, gas prices surged, housing costs surged. The cost of living increased faster than wages for most Americans. The Federal Reserve has since tried to control inflation by raising interest rates. Those higher rates slow the economy. They also make the government's debt more expensive to service. Interest payments on the debt are climbing rapidly. It's the same trap that caught Rome, Spain, and Britain. Print money to cover spending. Inflation follows. Raise interest rates to fight inflation. That makes debt more expensive, which creates pressure to print more money. It's a cycle that's almost impossible to escape once it starts. Stage 3? Check. So, what about stage 4? Loss of confidence and collapse. Are we there yet? Not fully, but the warning signs are appearing. Foreign central banks are slowly reducing their holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds. China has reduced its holdings. Russia has reduced its holdings. Other nations are discussing alternatives to the dollar for international trade. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are exploring ways to conduct trade without using dollars. Saudi Arabia, a key U.S. ally for 50 years, has discussed accepting currencies other than dollars for oil sales. This is crucial. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency gives the United States an enormous advantage. It means we can borrow cheaply. It means we can print money without immediately suffering hyperinflation, because dollars are absorbed by global demand. But if that status erodes, if major economies start conducting trade in other currencies, the consequences would be severe. Dollars held abroad would flood back to the United States. Inflation would spike. Interest rates would soar. The government's ability to borrow would collapse. This is the one factor mentioned at the beginning. When foreign nations stop accepting your currency, when they dump your bonds and refuse to hold your money, collapse accelerates from decades into years. Rome maintained the denarius as the dominant currency for centuries, even as it debased. But once confidence broke, the collapse was rapid. Spain's silver remained valuable as metal, but confidence in Spain's ability to pay debts collapsed, and with it, the empire. Britain's pound lost reserve currency status in a single generation, and the empire dissolved. The United States hasn't reached that point, not yet. The dollar remains the dominant reserve currency. U.S. Treasury bonds remain the safest investment in the world, or at least they're perceived that way. But the foundation is cracking, confidence is eroding, the pattern is unmistakable. So, where are we in the cycle? Beginning, middle, or end? Here's the honest answer. We're in stage 3, moving towards stage 4. We've completed military overextension, we've locked in unsustainable spending, we've begun currency debasement through money printing, and we're seeing the early warning signs of stage 4, rising inflation, declining confidence, foreign nations questioning the dollar's status. Are we at the beginning of stage 4 or deep into it? That's impossible to say with certainty. Empires can limp along in stage 4 for decades. Britain managed 30 years between the first serious cracks and final collapse. Or stage 4 can hit with devastating speed once a tipping point is reached. But here's what we know from history. Once an empire enters stage 3, reversing course becomes extraordinarily difficult. It requires making painful choices. Cutting, spending, reducing military commitments, accepting lower standards of living temporarily to avoid catastrophe long term. It requires political courage, leadership willing to tell citizens hard truths, a population willing to accept sacrifice. Rome didn't do it. Spanish monarchs didn't do it. British leaders tried, but only after it was too late. Will American leaders do it? Will American citizens accept it? History suggests the answer is no. Every empire believes it's different. Every empire believes it can avoid the pattern. Every empire chooses short-term political survival over long-term economic stability. But here's the thing. Patterns aren't destiny. They're warnings. They show what happens when certain choices are made. They also show that different choices lead to different outcomes. Some nations have avoided the empire collapse pattern. Switzerland has maintained currency stability for centuries. Singapore built a prosperous economy without imperial overreach. Germany recovered from hyperinflation in the 1920s and rebuilt with fiscal discipline. It's possible, but it requires recognizing the pattern, acknowledging the warning signs, and having the courage to change course before stage 4 becomes irreversible. So, let's recap what we've learned. The empire collapse pattern has 4 stages: military overextension, unsustainable spending, currency debasement, and loss of confidence leading to collapse. Rome followed this pattern and fell. Spain followed this pattern and fell. Britain followed this pattern and lost its empire. Thanks for watching. Stay informed, stay prepared, and remember, the pattern repeat until we learn from it.